Good. We're live.
Whoa.
Amazing.
Look at
Well,
that.
welcome everyone to the last day of build. It's
Yeah.
after lunch, which means everyone's taking a little nap.
Someone's happy about build being over.
Thanks everyone for coming out. We're really excited because we're going to be talking about how you can build beautiful mobile applications and pair them perfectly with ASP.NET Core, web APIs, and so much more. I'm James Montemagno. I'm a program manager for all of our mobile developer tools.
I am Glenn Condren. I am a program manager on .NET. You may know me from things like ASP.NET Core, or probably anything with Microsoft extensions in the name.
Yeah, and I forced him to come and demo with me
Yeah.
because I really know nothing, and he knows a lot of things about ASP.NET, and I know a lot of things about Xamarin.
Which I know nothing about.
Are we kind of the perfect
We
match?
may well
are.
be.
We complete each other.
Yeah.
Well, what I love about .NET as a whole is that it really enables me as a developer, or you as a developer, to develop for any single platform, whether it's web, mobile, desktop, gaming, IoT, .NET, C#, F#, VB.NET, anything that you want to program in, truly you can develop for it. And I'm a mobile developer, which I love, but of course every great front-end client needs a great back-end, and that's
Indeed
where
it does.
ASP.NET comes in.
Yeah. So, yeah, ASP.NET. It gives you web apps real time. You can build microservices. You can build APIs, which is amazing because APIs power the world effectively. Everything needs an API behind it, and I tried to make this argument a bunch internally because my boss says, tell me about cloud native, tell me about microservices, and I'm like, well, all of those things almost all end up boiling down to a bunch of APIs. Could we just talk about APIs? We've had those for a long time. Everybody needs them. Let's just keep making that amazing.
Yeah.
And we did. And we have been for a while. You guys have probably seen it. We have things like security and authentication basically built in, or at least very easy to turn on in a lot of really interesting scenarios, especially for when talking to your Xamarin backend, right?
Yeah.
And so easy to create. We tried to do our best when we moved on to ASP.NET Core to make it as quickly as possible. I mean, everybody tries to do this with all of their frameworks, but focus on business logic that you care about and like let the web kind of take care of the web and think about HTTP and stuff as little as possible. So how can we, as quickly as possible, stand up a thing that my application can talk to and get access to my data or whatever, right? I mean, make it easy. I think that seems pretty easy. Does that seem pretty easy? Like, I hope. There's a couple of people nodding. Yes, there's a couple of people taking photos, so that's great.
Yeah, even I can understand it, and I know nothing about web API.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the code kind of reads itself. You're going to HTTP get, people, an ID, or create.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah, and seems pretty good.
Yeah. And that's why ASP.NET and web APIs tied together with Xamarin creates a really great story, which I'll talk about here.
Yeah.
Now, I come from the Xamarin side of things, and really Xamarin as a whole is an open source app platform from us here at Microsoft to truly enable you to build for all sorts of different platforms that you wouldn't think .NET would go to, such as iOS, Android, macOS, watchOS, and tvOS applications.
Yeah.
So this means now you can take your .NET skills where you've been building web applications or desktop applications and apply them to all of these beautiful applications and build native apps.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what's cool about it is that we enable you to share code across all of those platforms. You can even share code with your ASP.NET Core application.
Indeed.
And so much more, and build beautiful applications.
Yeah.
What's unique about Xamarin is that you not only can share code in .NET Standard, but you get access to every single native API of iOS and Android, all in C#. So you never have to write Objective-C, Swift, or Java. Everything is there for you in C#.
Yeah. Super powerful, super productive.
Yes,
Right.
Very all about productivity. So let me show you a quick demo here of how these two technologies work together and some of the quirks when it comes to mobile development. So I'm over here on my Mac, and I'm inside of Visual Studio for Mac. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the structure here of my app, okay? So what we have here is sort of out of the box, I have an Android application, iOS application, and right here I have an ASP.NET Core application right there, right? You can see I'm still on 2.0 because that's what I'm on, but
Okay.
2.1, 2.2.
That's okay.
It's there. Shh.
Yeah.
You know, and what's nice here is that this is just an ASP.NET Core application. It has an item controller.
Right.
So very similar to what we saw earlier with that people controller.
Yeah.
I have an API controller. I have a way of getting all of them, do a ID get, a create that's here, adding them into the repository. But you're like, where's that item? Like, I don't, you know.
Where is the item?
There's an item repository. Where's the item? Well, what's cool is that what I've done is I've created a .NET Standard library that right now, because this is such a simplistic app, I've put the model in this separate .NET Standard library that's being shared with not only my ASP.NET Core backend, but also my mobile applications.
Right. Because the .NET Standard lets me reuse that same source code anywhere.
Right there.
Yeah. Look at that.
So that's really great. So you can start building that out. Now, if I had common logic, like I was doing data crunching on my web application and on my mobile applications, you put that all in that
so
single
this lets
place.
you then invoke your API, return an item from your API, and get the same type in C# in your mobile application, right?
Exactly.
Cool.
So then any of your normal deserialization, like with JSON.NET, that's going to be exactly the same. So if I look at the structure here of this app from a point of view of a mobile app, I have an Android and an iOS application. Those are my head projects. So here, that means any platform-specific code that I need is inside of here. So you can look at our references. I have some .NET stuff, and then Xamarin iOS. That's going to give me all of my iOS-specific APIs, and the same's true for Android. But this is using our cross-platform user interface called Xamarin Forms. So here I have some startup code in my app.xaml. And what this is going to do is create a new main page. And what that main page does over here is it has a few tabs in it. So I have some tabs, I have some navigation pages, browse and about. And what we want to do is fill in our items page with a list of items. So here, we're writing in a cross-platform Xamarin Form XAML, but when I run iOS or Android, we generate and spin up the native controls on each platform. So here I have a stack layout. Here I have a few items that I can look. I have pull to refresh to enabled. And you can sort of see when I'll run this application, it will display the native controls. But I need to get access to that stuff.
Yep,
so
you need to get some data.
Yep, so every view here, that items is tied to some code behind. It's very similar to a controller. Instead of MVC, we use MVV.
But there's a lot of analogies to an AS for but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an AS but there's a lot of analogies to an AS for an ASP.NET Core developer, right? Or an ASP.NET developer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what we have then is a way to call into this code. We have this data store. And this data store, whenever I pull to refresh or load, it's going to say get items asynchronously. And I'm going to show you this code, and you're going to be like, how do you make service calls with Xamarin? Well, use HTTP client. Exactly the same way you've been making HTTP calls forever, because with Xamarin, you get all of .NET with you.
Yeah.
So here I set up a base URL, and then down here, when I want to do gets or puts or anything, I can say get string async, hit that API via that URL. If I want to add it, I do a post. If I want to update, I can do a put. So I make just CRUD operation calls.
Yeah.
But there are some unique things with mobile.
Okay.
All right. So
What are they?
Why?
What are they?
What are they?
Yeah.
Why and what are they?
Yeah, both of those
I'm going to do the
questions,
why.
but- okay.
Well, all right, I'll tell you the why and the what. So first, I have this thing running locally here. This is my ASP.NET Core app.
Yeah.
I said .NET Run, running it right here.
Looks familiar.
It looks beautiful. It's running on localhost.
Yeah.
So the cool thing about iOS simulators
You're not running on localhost.
is that this one is your machine, so it is localhost.
That's fancy.
But
Okay.
Android is an emulator, not a simulator, so it is not running on localhost.
Right. So how do you resolve this problem? Because like if you go HTTP localhost my API, it's trying to talk to the phone. There's no API there.
Blows up.
Yeah.
Well, what we have here is when we come into this code, we'll see that I'm calling this Azure backend URL. And in all of our item templates, we've calculated the correct IP address for you automatically. Because nobody knows that, obviously, the Android emulator does port forwarding from localhost to port 10.0.2.2.
Yeah, that seems totally obvious.
Yeah, so
Like,
we
of
do
course,
that for
that's
you.
what it would do. What else could it possibly do?
And notice here that I'm also saying only use that IP address when you're on Android, because we have Xamarin Essentials, which offers a bunch of cross-platform APIs for you.
This is a cool pattern though too, right? There's a pattern you'll see in general, which is platform or OS or environment detection. You see this in ASP.NET Core as well, and then conditional logic based upon not only am I on Android or am I on Linux or am I on Windows, but am I on dev or am I in test or am I in production, right? And so you see this type of platform light up patterns appearing all over .NET, which is cool, right?
And there's another thing that you may have noticed: HTTP, no S. I sometimes have issues with dev certs. I'm not going to lie.
Somewhere Barry Dorans may just have set up, but he doesn't know why.
I can't figure out somehow to set up these certs. So I sometimes run locally on HTTP.
Okay.
But this also creates an issue. So on iOS and Android, you need to configure specifically here to allow clear text traffic. So it's a little config file. We also do that for you.
Right.
Or in your info plist, which is the decoration of your iOS app, you can add this thing called NS App Transport Security. Because now these mobile devices are so secure that they won't even allow non-HTTPS traffic through unless you do a special use case for it.
That's probably good. We deserve the pain because we're so bad. We're so terrible at this stuff.
So now what I can do is actually run this entire application.
Yeah.
You kind of have an idea for the structure, some of the setup that's here. And what we're going to do is we're going to run this app over here for both iOS and Android. So here, we're just going to spin it up on our emulators over here, and we can actually take a look at our ASP.NET Core backend. And what's nice and why I like doing this is that I can start to see everything sort of running over here on my machine. So if I come in and I add an item and I say, hello, Glenn.
Hi.
Right, and I go here and I save that.
And I see your API scrolling past this logs in the other window.
There you are, right?
And I'm appearing in the other phone. Yeah, that makes sense. I like it.
Right, and save that over there. I should probably put in a description. Whoa. Right, go ahead and put down that keyboard and then hit save. And I can pull the refresh, and then now immediately I can be really productive debugging on my machine, which is cool.
And just testing out the UIs across the seemingly 5,000 devices that my boss wants me to support.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, if I did this on Windows, it becomes a little bit tricky. The Android emulator runs on Windows just fine, so that IP address
is still the same.
So it works.
Right.
The problem is if you use our remoted iOS simulator for Windows, that iOS simulator is running on your Mac over there. So what I do is I'll just go and run my ASP.NET Core over there on Mac, and then I can actually debug it and things like that if I need to. And the reason this all works, by the way, is because this is all running on Kestrel. So if I go to my program here,
Kestrel,
use
actually,
Kestrel.
We have like a little bit of time. Quick poll. How many of you do a bunch of ASP.NET or ASP.NET Core or know a bunch about it? Okay. And how many of you do more Xamarin and don't know much about ASP.NET?
See, and all of
that's
you
great.
just raise your hands. You saw the other one raise hands.
How many
Best
of
friend.
you thought this is a trick question because we're all just .NET developers?
Yeah, you all are all of those things.
Good job.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay.
You even fooled me, actually.
Yeah.
Wow, got me. Not rehearsed. We didn't
so
do
for those
any
of you
rehearsing.
who haven't looked at Kestrel, that's our cross-platform web server, which lets you serve web traffic across all the OSs.
Yep.
All the OSs that matter. I don't know. There's probably one we don't support. I don't know.
Well, if you're on Linux or Mac over here, there's no IIS, so boom, you use Kestrel.
Yeah, it's Kestrel.
And that's why that all works. Cool. Now,
so
Glenn.
I don't know anything about mobile.
Yes, but you know about
But I
ASP.NET.
do know something about HTTP client.
Yes.
And I do know that newing one up every time you need to use one is usually not a good idea.
Well, that's true, but I know that ASP.NET has a bunch of really cool things in it, like HTTP client factory, config files, and
Environment
logging.
variables, logging. You saw some logging.
Yes.
And HTTP client factory specifically means that you don't have to make a HTTP client every time.
How do I get that though?
Good news.
Who doesn't want this in their Xamarin apps? Like that would be nice, like for free and officially supported from Microsoft. Like stamp of approval, signed NuGet package.
Great news, everybody.
Yeah.
Such a NuGet package exists.
Yes.
So, and I'm out of sync by one slide. I'm sorry.
Yes. It's this one.
I thought this was the next slide. So the Microsoft Extensions hosting package is all that stuff we just talked about, configuration, logging, dependency injection, HTTP client factory. Basically, it is the entry point. It is the builder pattern for host builder, and web host builder if you've been doing ASP.NET Core, but without web. So it has none of the ASP.NET dependencies. It is just that pattern of putting together all your dependencies, using DI, using config, using logging, and then running whatever code you want.
So it's like all this stuff
It's all of this,
that I just showed in web, but for mobile.
but for .NET.
Oh, for all of .NET, not just mobile, because we're one unified platform.
That's right.
Oh my goodness,
Look at
let's
this.
do it.
Okay.
So it kind of turns into something like this then, I guess, huh?
Yeah, it does. So you have the same, you saw this story we saw earlier. You have shared C#, you have shared code, shared class libraries across the world. With extensions, then what you have is a bunch of shared patterns. You have hosting, you have DI, config, logging, health checks, like all the stuff in the Microsoft extension space. And that's the same pattern and the same familiar code that you use when you're using ASP.NET or web jobs, or, as this talk is showing you, Xamarin Forms.
Amazing. So truly then, ASP.NET Core must equally love Xamarin back.
Exactly.
Yes, because we all love each other in the world of .NET.
Yeah.
All right, so what do I have to do here? So I put there's NuGets I need to bring in, right? Is that what I need to do?
Yeah, so you add that NuGet package that we had on the slide earlier.
Whoa, I
Microsoft
did it
Extensions
already. It's
Hosting.
already there. Amazing. It's like
As
we
if-
rehearsed.
As if you were prepared for this.
Wow. Okay, so I
Yeah.
have hosting. And what are these other things here?
Right. So now what you've gotten in here is Microsoft Extensions HTTP is where you get HTTP Client
I
Factory
like that.
from.
And what is this thing?
Microsoft Extensions HTTP Poly, some of you might be familiar with the Poly library. It's this open source .NET library that lets you do retries, circuit breakers, basically a lot of connection resiliency type features. So here's the thing about your mobile app. What if temporarily you can't connect to your backend API?
Impossible. T-Mobile would never give me issues ever, especially in a conference center with thousands of people.
That's right. So if you're ever in that situation, like all the time on a mobile application, you probably want to occasionally retry that backend API because you've had some sort of connectivity glitch.
I like that.
Poly does that for you.
So
It
I've
can
done
do
that.
that for you.
All right, so here's what I'm going to do. I have that same code from earlier.
Yeah.
And what I'm going to do here is instead of registering with the Xamarin Forms dependency service,
Right. So the,
I think there's stuff.
the Xamarin folks in the room who have done a bunch of mobile have probably seen that sort of stuff before. For those of you who have done a bunch of web, that thing is kind of a Xamarin version of service provider. You can do service provider.get on it, right?
So I created this little startup.init, and right now what I have is I have pretty much nothing. I added a JSON config file here.
Yeah, app settings JSON. Yeah.
Look at this.
Look at that. Looks just like an ASP.NET Core application.
I'm in production because
You
why
are.
not?
Yeah,
Hello world.
All the time. Yeah,
Yeah.
seems good.
So
What else
what-
would you choose?
Yeah, exactly. So what I've done here is I've gone ahead and copied that locally on disk. It's
Yeah.
an embedded resource.
This is just a trick to get the file on disk, right?
So what do I need to do first?
So now you want to make a host builder.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just type that up
Yeah.
and build that.
Good job. That's some good typing.
All right,
right
what
there.
else am I doing here? Command
This is how all
line.
good developers program.
Yep, okay.
So what we're doing here is we're saying create the configuration system. So you use iConfiguration in ASP.NET Core applications. This is making an ASP configuration setup. It's adding a command line config source, and that's adding the JSON file.
All right.
And like this here is just a trick to tell us where because on mobile where files are.
Are all over the place.
So I discovered from James,
Yeah.
they're somewhat finicky about where files live on mobile. So this is telling where to use it via a convenient Xamarin API that
Yep.
works it out for us.
And then what else can I do? I can probably
Well,
like configure stuff, right?
Yeah, so now, once you've got config, and this gives you host builder and config, now you need services. You need to register things in the DI container because you want centralized DI, right? Like everybody, all good ASP.NET Core developers want DI. So here we're going to say configure services, and we're invented this func that calls our configure services method. And now we want logging, right? Because
Yeah.
everybody needs logging. Because how else can you find out what's broken? Because there's no other good way to do it,
right.
especially when your app is running through 7 layers of emulation.
Exactly. And it's all right there built in.
Yeah, and now it's all here. All we're doing here is disabling colors because most of the convenient ways of getting these console logs out don't render ANSI colors. So
Yeah.
we just disable that. Right?
And then I build.
And then you build.
Done.
Right? Now, for those of you who have built an ASP.NET Core application before, this should look pretty familiar. So the next thing what we want to do is presumably grab the service provider, right?
Yes. I'm going to
Yeah.
grab my service provider there.
Yeah, so once you've called build, then the host has this services property, which gives you the service provider. So now, from the service provider, anywhere in your app, you can say get, and you can get any of the services that were registered in this building pattern.
Very cool.
Right? So this is kind of interesting on its own. But where it becomes super powerful is this gives you a gateway into all of the Microsoft.extension stuff. For example, you can access the configuration in here as part of this context that you see the same in your ASP.NET Core application. You have hosting environments, so you can tell whether you're R development or you're not development based upon a config setting that you can flow through your application. So in here, he's saying if I'm in dev, use a pretend one. If I'm anywhere else, use Azure Data. And you saw earlier in his app settings config file that right now he's just always saying he's in production. Right? But you could add more config providers, pull config from other locations, and have that dynamically change. And then the next thing that's awesome is we can add HTTP client. So what this does is you add a HTTP client factory to this container, and now it manages the lifetime of HTTP client instances, so kind of dispose them as much as required. If anybody really wants to ask me about why that's important, she knows what I'm talking about. Then you can come talk to me about it later if you don't already know, because you don't have a lot of time. But this is saying, make me a new HTTP client for this backend URL and configure this retry policy. Retry once after a second, then retry a second time, retry a third time, waiting longer in between each one.
Yep.
Right? So it waits a little bit, then it retries. That's what these three are doing.
Yeah. And then
Make
the last thing I do here, and that's part of Poly, is add a transient to my items view model. So you can add singletons or transients. So my view models I want to create every time.
Yeah, so transients, every time you ask for one, you get a new one. Singleton, they live for the whole app.
Now what I can do is I can come into this items view model and notice that I'm injecting an iData store. I registered an iData store, so this will automatically be created for me.
Yeah.
Better yet, we can go ahead and delete this default constructor. And what we can do
I feel much more comfortable now.
Yeah, is now pass in an iLogger that I can log to console and an HTTP client factory.
Yeah.
And then I can use that HTTP client factory and make those calls, or I could come down here and log things. So I'm going to go ahead and recompile this application up over here with all of our changes that we made. And ideally, with just that startup code, we'll have registered our view model, which will inject in our data store, which will then inject in our logger and our HTTP client factory that is going to use Poly to retry automatically.
Yeah, with a few lines of code, you've kind of got access to this whole slew of stuff that are being created for all the .NET ecosystem. Now, what else is interesting about this is you kind of get to use as much or as little as you want. If you're not necessarily a fan of DI, we'll throw the service provider into your main app and just call get whenever you need it instead of calling new just for that thing. And then mostly ignore it. If you like DI, you can use more and more and more and more and more. You can use more config, more logging. Use whatever makes you happy. Right?
Yep. So right here, you can see I'm logging out that getting items, and with zero effort at all, I'm able to come in.
HTTP client factory for the win. Tells me how long the HTTP request took for, automatically did retries, and takes care of disposing it in appropriate times so that you don't have to keep one around forever or get socket exhaustion from taking too many.
Magic. Now what's cool here is that everything I've just shown you is on my GitHub, and I have another model, another application that actually injects the entire page. I'm not going to have time to run it here, but I'll run you through what I did. I register a view model, my entire page, and my entire app. And I do DI all the way up to the top level, which is absolutely bananas.
So at this point, you should be able to just constructor inject basically every type in your thing, right? And you get all the types.
And it's officially supported
by
Microsoft and works with any .NET application.
It does indeed. In fact, we couldn't make ASP.NET Core because this is the thing that sits underneath ASP.NET Core. So it has to be supported by Microsoft.
That's right. Well, Glenn, thank you so much. I hope that everyone knows that there's tons of great Xamarin sessions that occur. This was the last one here. All the recordings are live on our Xamarin developers YouTube page. Take a look at all of those. Also, all of the code for all of this is right here on my GitHub page for not only the application that I showed you, but the one that injects the entire application. It's bananas. We want to hear from you, so please email us if you like this. We want to make it an official thing, but you can already use it today because it works.
You can use it today. There's more work we can always do. If you guys love it and use it a lot, we can always keep doing work to make it better and better and more suited for these sorts of things. So let us know if you like it or not.
And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a great build.